Welcome back, everyone. Okay, so today we're diving into a really fascinating explainer that unpacks a fairly radical idea. If you've ever looked at our massive legal institutions and thought, wow, these are just completely out of touch with basic human reality, well, this is absolutely going to resonate with you. We're looking at a sweeping critique of modern family law, and more importantly, a highly specific medical-grade solution designed to fix it. Let's get right into it. Think about this for a second. Would you undergo invasive open-heart surgery without an anesthesiologist there to monitor your vitals? No way, right? It's completely unthinkable. But the text we're exploring today asks us to take that exact same biological reality and apply it to the psychological reality of navigating the family law system. It raises a huge question. Why do we demand such rigorous, real-time monitoring for our physical nervous systems, but we just accept absolute zero monitoring for our psychological ones when our lives are literally being taken apart? Look at the stark contrast here. It really hits the nail on the head. On one side, you have a modern operating room. It's objective, it's safe, and the patient's vitals are meticulously tracked to prevent shock. But then, on the flip side, we have the unmonitored courtroom. The sources argue this environment is highly subjective, inherently hostile, and completely ignores the massive trauma being inflicted on the people involved. It's basically a system operating completely in the dark. All right, moving to Section 1, the unmonitored surgery. So, how exactly did our courts get this out of touch? The source uses this wild, vivid imagery to explain it. It argues that the legal system right now operates like a primitive surgeon. Imagine a doctor just flat out refusing to use modern precision tools, and instead they're hacking away with a vice grip and a scalpel, totally ignoring the patient's distress. Modern courts hold that exact same life-altering power over us, yet they completely refuse to monitor the psychological vitals of the people they're operating on. Which brings us to Section 2, the divorce industrial complex. Okay, so what actually happens when families get thrown into this unmonitored surgical theater? The sources introduce this concept called the divorce industrial complex. And the crucial takeaway here is that this isn't a broken system. Actually, it's functioning exactly as it was designed to. Its main goal isn't to resolve human conflict. It's essentially a mechanism for extraction. It's built to drain financial and intellectual capital from families right when they're at their most fragile. When you actually break down the mechanics of this complex, it gets pretty dark. The text alleges the system actively weaponizes a lack of family support. Basically, if you don't have a built-in safety net, you're an easy target. It completely disregards the severe psychological toll, heavily penalizes anyone who falls outside standard socioeconomic norms, and this is a massive claim. It essentially operates as domestic abuse scaled up by the state itself. So there's this tragic gap between what we're taught and what's actually real. We expect ideal due process, right? An objective, truth-seeking search for justice. But the sources claim victims actually run into weaponized legal formalism. The text vividly describes the current legal environment as a house of mirrors. It's chaotic, precarious, and completely subjective. Bad actors can just exploit vulnerable families with zero accountability, and it's all done under the very clinical guise of asset liquidation. Let's look at Section 3, Ecosystems of Avoidance. Now, you might be wondering, if this system is so obviously destructive, why on earth do we allow it to continue unchecked? Well, the answer lies in human psychology. There's this profound quote from the text: "It's very hard for people to stay with someone else's pain. The mind tries to protect itself." When we're confronted with raw, intense trauma, our involuntary reflex is just to look away. It hurts too much to watch, so our brains simply disengage. But here's the catch. The source argues that when you scale up that perfectly natural human reflex, it becomes incredibly dangerous. It creates an ecosystem of avoidance. Because society as a whole struggles to look at deep human pain, we structurally design our institutions to just ignore it. This creates a toxic societal setup where massive systemic injustices are allowed to thrive completely unchecked, simply because no one wants to look at the collateral damage. And this brings us right back to the courts. The text argues that the legal system completely lacks the sophistication needed to recognize psychological trauma. It functions as the ultimate avoidance ecosystem. When victims express deep trauma, the system just turns a blind eye, leaving the vulnerable completely isolated while the machinery just keeps grinding them down. Okay, let's dive into the solution. Section 4, the courtroom surgical monitor. So how do we actually break this cycle of systemic avoidance? The source proposes a 3-step reconciliation model. Step 1 is the absolute prerequisite. We have to actively acknowledge and bear witness to the raw pain of the individual. You literally cannot rush to debate facts until the pain is witnessed. Step 2 is establishing a restorative healing circle. And step 3, implementing truly objective, deterministic legal frameworks so the abuse can never be repeated. Right, so what does step 1 look like in practice? It looks like the courtroom's surgical monitor. The source is fiercely advocating for the mandatory presence of a neutral therapist during court proceedings. Just like that anesthesiologist in surgery, this therapist is there to actively witness the trauma and monitor the psychological distress of the parties in real time. If the system starts acting abusively or if someone is going into psychological shock, the monitor enforces basic surgical safety standards and calls it out right then and there. To give this some real legal teeth, the source pulls in this brilliant concept from existing tort law, the thin skull principle. This principle says you take your victim as you find them. If they have a rare condition making them more vulnerable, you're still completely responsible for the damage you cause. The argument here is that courts must finally recognize that a psychological injury is real. It is just as verifiable and vulnerable as a physical broken bone, and the system absolutely must be held liable when it shatters someone's mind. Finally, Section 5, Sparking Societal Healing. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the massive, macro-level changes this single reform could trigger. If we actually mandate psychological monitoring in courtrooms, the societal benefits are huge. First, it forces tangible institutional accountability. Second, it restores the integrity of the nuclear family by completely removing the financial incentive to destroy it. And third, it stops the legal system from purposefully turning ordinary citizens into traumatized, alienated outliers. It really all boils down to this one punchy quote from the text. Once we have the divorce industrial complex healed, everything else is a cakewalk. The author firmly believes that family law, specifically how the state handles the dissolution of families, is the absolute root cause of so much of our broader societal dysfunction. Fix this one deep systemic rot, and the rest of our societal healing will naturally follow. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this lingering thought to chew on. We build systems to protect us, right? But when those very courts and communities operate without structural psychological guardrails, who protects the vulnerable from the system itself? Implementing a courtroom surgical monitor might just be the first step in finally answering that question. Thank you for joining me for this breakdown, and keep asking the hard questions.